So I called this lecture sometime when I wrote this lecture, and I just wanted to let you guys know I use the terms Black, African American interchangeably. Some people get upset about that. I don't know what to do for them. I grew up with the term Black, and at some point, I think around when I was in college, it changed to African American. I used both of them. I never found Black to be particularly offensive. So occasionally I'll say Black political thought. And then sometimes I'll use Black political thought, particularly when I'm talking about various kinds of international contexts, right? Because people of African descent in the UK or Brazil are not African Americans, obviously. Well, in Brazil, they're African Americans, but then we'd have to reconfigure the term that we understand to be Americans, which is not US Blacks, which is, we'd have to think of the Americas. So in some senses, this terminology can get to be problematic at a certain point. So just to sort of put that out there, we'll never talk about it again. But one thing I call this lecture diversity and continuity, in one sense to say that Black political thought is diverse. There are definitive and different kinds of trends. But there also is a kind of continuity. We can establish that there have been sort of historically established trends that carry over time and exist throughout the history of African Americans. And I'll sort of set up the terms, at least some of that. If we look at the faces that are represented here, we have a series of different trends of Black political thought, African American political thought. We have Malcolm X representing a kind of Black nationalist ethos, Martin Luther King, the traditional civil rights perspective, and we'll begin to define different forms of that ethos. We have Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas, who is a Black conservative. We have former UCLA professor Angela Davis, who is a Marxist. And of course, we have one of the more famous African-American political thinkers, speakers, et cetera, now President-elect, soon to be President, Barack Obama, who probably represents the liberal tradition quite well, but liberal with a small L, and we'll talk about that a little bit, but one that is also engaged with and sometimes uses some of the rhetoric of Black nationalists, Black feminists, and even on occasion Marxists and conservatives. And so the idea is that all these people are just in our contemporary moment, but if we look across history, that kind of diversity, clear ideological differences, has been a sort of hallmark of discourses and discussions within the Black community. So the course objectives, not objections. If you have any objections, let me know, but or keep them to yourself one way or the other. Course objectives is to deepen your understanding of African American thought, political thought, develop critical thinking skills. In fact, the sort of central aspect of this course is that it's built around a problem and a series of debates. There is no right answer. I'm not going to tell you African Americans ought to do X. There's not going to be any answer about that. It's going to be about the different approaches and debates to heighten your ability to identify ideological trends and tendencies, both within the African American community, but if we understand that there's nothing, nationalist thinking is not unique to African Americans, Marxist thinking is not unique to African Americans, conservative political thinking is not unique to African Americans. It will sharpen your ability to identify different sort of ideological trends and thoughts wherever you see them in the public sphere. And we're also going to explore normative debates. We're going to talk about the debates about what does the good society look like, which I think is one of the essential aspects of any political thought. That goes all the way back to sort of Plato, right? He's going to write his sort of ideal society. So some of the course organization assumption, I'm going to assume that you know that there was a civil rights movement, that there was a guy named Martin Luther King, and something happened called Black Power. Some of that's going to be assumed. If you don't know that, hit Wikipedia fast. No, the point is that this is a kind of upper division course. It's both an upper division course in political science, but also an Afro-Am. Martin Luther King Day is coming up rapidly. So I'm not going to do a basic. I'm going to refer to historical context. I will sometimes give a kind of historical description of what's going on in certain points, but I'm not going to spend all my time doing the sort of, okay, and then they went to Selma, and after that, so-and-so, and this happened at this X and Y march, et cetera. It's going to focus on the political thought, and I'll do a sort of minimal historical contextual movements, but it kind of assumes that you know those things happen. So if you don't know that there was a civil rights movement in the US and that something called Black Power followed, et cetera, this may not be the course for you, because it's a advanced discussion given a set of knowledge about those things. One of the things that often happens is that African American political thought is frequently divided into two streams. Now we're starting to get away from that, and I think Dawson's work and the work of some others has been sort of instrumental in that. But it was always integrationism versus nationalism, or integrationism versus separatism, and that was a kind of vulgar division of African American political thinking. And this course is going to largely take that particular question as simply whether or not African Americans should integrate, or should they, and in what degree should they integrate versus should they separate, is a tactical question that fits into larger political philosophical trends. It does not define African American political thought. As for a long time, people taught or thought about African American political thought on that sort of axis, and we're going to move away from that. Just to let you know this, all African Americans do not think alike. Yeah, and look, it's worth bearing in mind. I mean, for instance, when this book was in progress, I once saw Professor Michael Dawson present some of the aspects of this book, and the response by a very well-established political scientist at Harvard was, well, if I'm in a plane at 30,000 feet and I'm looking at African American political thought or African American politics, everybody votes, 96% vote Democratic. So all that you're talking about is just a kind of waste of time, right? For me, they all think about politics in the very same ways. And one of the things that leads into the second point is actually this was done right around the time when the Million Man March happened, right, led by Louis Farrakhan. So Louis Farrakhan asks 1 million African American men to show up in Washington, D.C., and he's going to talk to them about political issues in the community from a sort of nationalist basis, and in fact, largely rejecting a lot of ideas of, say, for instance, what you would call the Democratic Party. And if one doesn't pay attention to issues in African American political thought, in particular the importance of Black nationalism, one would not have been able to explain why 1 million people showed up in D.C., or probably slightly more than 1 million people. And so one of the things that we're going to talk about is politics beyond voting. In particular, given the fact that large portions of the African American population were disenfranchised up until 1965. It's impossible to think about African American politics. A large percentage of African American politics has been expressed not necessarily through voting activity, just as a lot of politics in general operates outside of the constructed institutions that are designed to channel what are quote unquote legitimate political activity. And so we're going to think about politics in terms of social movements and other kinds of things, other kinds of political expressions, and only sort of rarely talk about voting, since given the fact that we have a two-party winner-takes-all system, the range of ideological possibilities within American voting is frequently extraordinarily truncated. That's in part why we have a extraordinary set of different sort of political discourses, et cetera, available to people that transcend that. Whereas in other countries where you have different kinds of parliamentary systems, you may have 30 or 40 different political parties. And so you might have a black nationalist party or a black feminist party or Chicano nationalist party, et cetera, that would elect somebody to office, et cetera. And in fact, in some ways, right, you have a situation even now where, for instance, he's recently been in the news, Congresswoman Bobby Rush has been in the news recently from Chicago, who's a former Black Panther, right? So the current Democratic Party contains everyone to, very sort of committed free market capitalists, ex-Black Panthers, people who are socialists, and a bunch of different things in between. So in some ways, the parties are very broad, but their sort of general platforms and the sort of basis of voting frequently doesn't capture that variation, though sometimes we can pick it up within certain kinds of political races at very local levels, particularly ones where there are two or three African-American candidates in primary races. So central questions. What is the relationship between African Americans and the American creed or American liberalism? And I'm using liberalism not in the Rush Limbaugh sense, but in the John Stuart Mill sense, the philosophical liberalism. We're not talking about liberals, the sort of dirty word as Rush Limbaugh throws it around. And we're going to move somewhat beyond historical, beyond just a historical account, but sort of try and get into the sort of philosophical debates between trends, but also begin to discuss on some level the interplay between historical events and philosophy. And there's an implicit argument that's going to be running throughout this course, but I'll put it out there now, that African American political thought provides a commentary on America that is essential to understanding the modern U.S. That we can't, without sort of understanding the African American experience as a central and defining part of the U.S. tapestry, we'd be unable to understand the development of things, the development of American political institutions, but also American political thought. So first of all, we have to establish some real categories, and those of you who've taken my classes before have probably seen this. But one of the things we have to ask is that African Americans exist in the concept of African American, right, is not the idea that someone identifies as such or believes it as such is not necessarily, it's not a natural category, it's not a scientific category, it has no real meaning or utility outside of its sort of social, historical, political, and economic existence. So race itself, this class will take the approach that race itself is a social construction, right? That there's nothing scientific, biological about race, but that at the same time race is real. not real in a biological sense, right? That we can identify African Americans vis-a-vis some biological test, but that race is real through lived experience. That is that the fact that even though these categories are scientifically fictitious, the fact that we believe that, and consistently in the sets of social interactions that we have, that we believe that they have some kind of utility and organize the world, means that we act upon them in various ways. We act upon a lot of things that operate in this way, that have no scientific basis. And so therefore, race has a reality that is based in sort of real experience rather than biological construction. And just to kind of explain that to people, what we understand to be markers of being African American, meaning phenotype, right? Sort of skin color, et cetera, are not a set of features that are defined by a genetically discrete population, right? You cannot, there is no genetically discrete population called African Americans. And there's as much genetic variation between people who we place in the category of African American as there is between people who we understand to be, as there is between people who are not African American, or there's as much genetic similarity between people who are not African American, who are African American, who are not African American, as there is genetic similarity between people who are placed in the same racial or ethnic categories. That's been determined time and time again. And one of the things is for instance, so what is the current president-elect? So there's been these articles, so people are saying different things. People are saying he's black, he's biracial. So there were these articles. There was an article that came out a couple of weeks ago that was like, well, what really is he, right? And it was sort of taking issue with him identifying himself as an African American because he's, his father was Kenyan, his mother was obviously a white woman from Kansas, and he was raised by white grandparents. But the point is that he has chosen to identify himself as an African American primarily. He has chosen that as his primary identity. And if race is indeed a social construction, right? People perceive him that way, except for those, flights of fancy when people decided to say that he was an Arab in various interesting points. People kept trying to refer back to a kind of biological notion of race. So his mother is white, so therefore he must identify as biracial. But if we think about race as a social category, that in terms of he responds to how people react to him, people have truly react to him as an African American. He is socially an African American. He also chooses that identity for himself. There's no reason why he can't simultaneously say, yes, my mom is white, but I am an African American. And that's to say, to end with a kind of definition that race is a construct born out of the process of colonization, Western expansion, and slavery that is used as a technology to differentiate human beings. It is a social, political, economic, and historic construct that is constantly reinforced by both by state action and everyday experience. Racial identities are both chosen and imposed simultaneously. So that is, I might decide tomorrow that I was white, but it wouldn't necessarily be that the people who dealt with me in a social experience would accept that. And so this is one of the points is that one of the central core aspects of African American political thought has been trying to deal with the sort of arbitrary nature of the category of race and its meaning for people's experience, right? So being branded as black at one point meant that you were a slave, perhaps, rather than free. It meant that you may or may not be able to vote. It meant that you might be, if you did certain things, it meant who you could marry, who you could not. And on some level, right, if we understand the sort of unity of all humanity, we understand that that category was arbitrary. At the same time, people have used that category both as a mode of resistance, but also to construct a kind of coherent community, et cetera, in different kinds of ways. And there's a certain kind of tension between the existence of race as this sort of negative and arbitrary category, but also its existence as a mode of resistance in certain times. And so in some ways, this definition captures the way in which, and race comes out of, race as we know it in the Western world, comes out of a particular set of experiences. Colonization, Western expansion, the transatlantic slave trade are the things that generated the notions of race that we now live with. Race was not, in particular scientific racism, was not an ancient category. People in the ancient world did not perceive and didn't talk about race per se. They might talk about skin color differences or et cetera, but they didn't classify it in terms of race as the scientific concept we know. That was born out of those set of experiences, the discovery of the Americas, et cetera. So that being said, there's always a kind of tension, and we have to sort of historically ground both our sort of understanding of those categories, but also the responses to them. So I raise this question sort of black and white, meaning in some ways, and I should put sort of left and right, one of the central arguments of this course is that can you put black political thought on the left-right continuum that exists in sort of standard sort of politics? And a political scientist by the name of Anthony Downs created these accounts of politics, sort of saying, well, there's a median voter in the middle. I'll kind of show it to you. Let's see if we can. You know, the median voter is somewhere here, or it may move slightly here, and there's a single continuum of a single set of issues, normally how much government intervention there should or should not be in the economy, and everyone sort of sorts themselves out on this continuum some way, and that kind of exhausts the political space. The problem is that race is a kind of third space, and in particular African-American political thought is a kind of third space. And we'll talk about how, for instance, it was once, John McCain was once speaking, and he identified Louis Farrakhan as being on the left. And I responded, so Louis Farrakhan is fairly, anti-gay, takes an extraordinarily restrictive view towards abortion, women's rights, does not support broad government intervention in the economy, in fact, believes in sort of small style capitalism. We'll talk about this ad nauseum. And so how would you place him on the left, in particular on that continuum, right? He's against welfare, he's against that kind of dependency. So he doesn't necessarily fit those sets of dimensions of politics. And it represents this sort of different and distinct African-American experience within the American polity. And there's a whole set of different issues that are in some ways sort of orthogonal to the standard left-right continuum that one might understand, as well as a kind of resistance to the basic sort of structure of a standard left-right continuum of politics. One could think about, just to do a thought experiment, one could think about a place where this plays out really interesting. If you think about the island of Puerto Rico. In the island of Puerto Rico, they have 3 different political parties. And the political parties aren't defined by the stand. Does anyone know what the political parties are defined by in Puerto Rico? So they're not defined by the intervention, government intervention or non-government intervention in the economy. The parties in Puerto Rico are defined by what is the proposed relationship to the U.S. So should we stay in our current Commonwealth status? Do we want to become a state, or should we be independent? And so you have people who are registered members of the US Democrat and Republican Party who are both in the statehood party or both in the Commonwealth Party and who have very different ideas about the economy, but that's not the central issue which organizes politics for Puerto Ricans. What organizes politics in their political parties is largely the status issue. What is our relationship to the U.S.? And so we can think about politics in a much more multidimensional space beyond the kind of easy discussions of left and right as defined by economic intervention. And so, but one of the things that I would say that African American political thought is always a response to is the kind of core philosophical principles of American liberalism. But it's interesting that frequently we follow these principles or articulate them, but we don't really take a time to think about them directly. And so I'm going to lay them out to you. So here are some of the kind of core philosophical principles of American liberalism. One, celebration of the boundaries between public and private, an emphasis on individual rights versus collective rights, profound restrictions on government action with fewer restrictions on private power or the movements of private property, and the primacy of the market and local government over central authority. These are some of the central tenets of American liberalism. And then there's one question, which has been a sort of evolving one, is at least officially colorblind, though frequently in practice not. And we'll talk about that, both the sort of, in fact, early liberalism was not at all colorblind, actually, in fact, but in our sort of current manifestations. So here we see a series of kind of tenets or a sort of set of balances that we understand to be sort of liberalism, but also in many cases is frequently the sort of dominant strain of American liberalism is a kind of libertarian ideal, right, as articulated by this. And this stuff largely comes from folks like Thomas Jefferson. But there's a series of kind of myths and realities, right, of American liberalism. On the left, we have colorblindness, that it always respects individual rights, that the principles are universally applied, and that the market functions effectively. I guess we don't really talk about markets functioning effectively these days. After someone makes off with a few $1 billion just to, $50 billion or something like that. But of course, on the other side, you have things like the 3/5 clause, Plessy versus Ferguson that defines segregation. We have slavery, the lack of women's rights, the lack of rights for immigrants, the fact that Native Americans were dispossessed of their lands. Those are all a set of things that show that individual rights, colorblindness, universal principles were not necessarily applied. We have women, poor whites, Native Americans, and African Americans have often faced extraordinarily unequal things, and they've often been restrained in terms of their attempts to enter the marketplace, right? If you're a slave, you aren't capable of selling your labor freely in the marketplace. You don't have basic freedoms to sell your market. If you're facing employment discrimination, right, the marketplace for you is constrained by that discrimination. You are not able to enter the market or participate in the market as a free individual in many cases. So, and we have to, in particular, the central institution that we have to go back to in terms of sort of the genesis of African American political thought and African American politics per se, is the practice of American slavery, or the institution of American slavery, which determined the terms of black incorporation in the U.S. And so frequently people like to use the term that blacks were marginalized or left outside of the U.S. And I kind of really object to that, right? Which is, yeah, they were left outside of participating in voting and having full citizenship rights, but they were profoundly incorporated, right? And they were incorporated on a certain set of terms, which was the mass majority were slaves. They were not free. They were an essential labor force in the development of the country, and that determined a particular set of relationships, but not only that, a set of institutions and thoughts. So we had a state of violence that frequently, for a large portion of history, that has faced African Americans in the midst of a kind of triumphalist take on the development of American democracy. So that is lynch law. We have here both sort of lynchings as well as someone who had been beaten by whips, et cetera, the kind of use of violence and brute force to extract labor, obedience, and to limit political activity was used in the midst of a kind of celebration of the U.S. as the highest expression of democracy. And it represents a kind of contradiction, but perhaps not in some cases. And even then, we have even extreme violence like the killings of a young child in Mississippi, Emmett Till. We just recently had Oakland is going through riots right now because a BART police officer that resonated with people historically appears to have shot a young African-American male in the back New Year's Eve while he was laying down. So we're having riots in Oakland, California right now. These kinds of issues of violence have been repeated, and these are the pictures. This is Emmett Till shortly before he was taken by a white mob for whistling at a white woman in Mississippi. That's him as his mother laid him out in Chicago after having been lynched and murdered. But resistance to this is the birth of black politics. And it begins with slave rebellions like those from Nat Turner, Denmark Vesey, the Amistad, the abolition movement, the development of black organizations like churches, things like the civil rights movement, the anti-Vietnam War movement, urban rebellions and riots like those that happened in Watts, movements defined by let's go back to Africa, it's so bad here, the anti-apartheid movement, and even joining movements and causes like movements to end U.S. intervention in places like Central America and or Haiti, Panama, et cetera. These have all been expressions of black politics that are resisting dominant strains, but there's also been expressions of black politics which have sought to accommodate or to fit into the sort of dominant sort of policy, foreign policy agenda and overall ideals of the U.S. But in particular, but these are all these sort of acts of various kinds of resistance. We see here, and all aspects of these resistance have not, neither now nor have they ever been entirely only joined or articulated by black people. Here we have the figure of John Brown, who's generally portrayed the way he is on the right as a nut, who decided to launch a raid on Harper's Ferry in 1859, shortly before the Civil War, in order to, his ideal was that he was going to get guns, he was going to distribute them to the slaves, and they were going to end the institution of slavery because he saw it conflicted with what he perceived to be his religious beliefs and was a blight on both America, but also a sin against God. John Brown is frequently perceived to be as a nut, right? What was that? It was almost crazy. He was a religious fanatic. He didn't know what he was doing. Even if one reads something like the Confessions of Nat Turner, who launched a slave rebellion that killed many whites, and Nat Turner, when he was asked, he said, "Well, God told me to do it because this institution is wrong. I talked to God. The angels came to me and they said, you need to go out and exact revenge on this." And so many people who resisted were perceived to be crazy. Meanwhile, what was the sort of genesis of the United States of America to begin with? Sort of freedom, but it was a tax revolt, right? So they were pissed off about their taxes and their lack of representation, and they started a fight with their colonial power, the UK. Otherwise, we would still be British and drink tea in the afternoon. And the whole point is that some forms of resistance are celebrated, like the American Revolution, but these forms of resistance are often sort of denigrated as not advancing the cause of freedom or American democracy, but as being sort of coming from the mob. And in some ways, we'll talk about that tension. It's ongoing. We can think about organizations, but one of the things is that this kind of resistance and people, places, and participants in them that have also participated in Black political thought are not always Black people. John Brown clearly is an important figure. He is not by any stretch of the imagination, nor was he African American. We can think about organizations like the Society of Friends or the Quakers, who early on took a kind of abolitionist point of view, interacting with people like Frederick Douglass, et cetera, as well as articulating a sort of vision of pacifism that's been attractive for many, and provided a lot of resources and possibilities for different Black political actors. And so we can think about Black politics as both being engaged with and articulated by Black people, but also being engaged in other kinds of struggles. So if I go back and talk about the anti-apartheid movement, not limited to the US, right? One of the central movements that African Americans engaged in the 1980s was the struggle against apartheid in South Africa. We can think about the anti-war movement, and particularly the anti-Vietnam movement, where organizations like the Black Panthers, as well as people like Martin Luther King, opposed the Vietnam War. We could think about the Central American peace movement, where actors in sort of both the American Civil Rights Movement, the anti-apartheid struggle, also joined with others to oppose U.S. intervention in places like Central America, which is not ostensibly a kind of Black issue per se. And we can see that Black politics are not only limited, are not only articulated by Black people about Black issues, but are articulating with a series of issues that frequently go beyond the set of concerns of African Americans. We can think about one of the central events in Black politics in the Americas is the Haitian Revolution of 1804. And this is the figure of Toussaint Louverture. Haiti becomes the first Black republic, the second independent nation in the Americas, by overthrowing, by slaves, former slaves, essentially overthrow the French, using the French Republican mantra of liberty, fraternity, and equality, and defeating their French colonial power and becoming the first Black republic. The Haitian Revolution set off shockwaves, which set terms of the U.S. sort of militarized the way in which they handled slaves. Haitians were not allowed to travel to the United States. There were, and some of the first immigration laws were designed to prevent Haitians from coming to the U.S. Why did you not want Haitians to come to the U.S. in 1804, 1805? Yeah. Right. Yeah, go ahead.
They're a horrible example for the U.S. So why would you want to put in black people in the U.S. that, hey, you could overthrow your system?
Right. You don't want these people coming around who've successfully overthrown a slave system, taken over, right? The idea that and one has to think about, right? Significant parts of the South in this particular period in early American history were majority black. South Carolina, many of the states and territories in the South did not have a majority white population at the time. So a large-scale massive slave rebellion could potentially have been successful in various places and had to be effectively presented. But Haiti represented a kind of alternative vision to the U.S., as well as, and this is a sort of blacks engaging in and trying to challenge different kinds of things. And one thing is that there has always been the use of military and violence to control sort of African-American political demands. We have urban riots as expressions of various forms of black politics around. These are some of the larger scale ones. Chicago, 1919, as well as in those times in Harlem, New York, and other parts of New York. We have riots in Los Angeles, particularly in Watts, 1965, 1991. We have major riots following the assassination of Martin Luther King in 1968 in Detroit, Chicago, and Atlanta. And so black political expression has frequently been, some expressions have been through existing institutions. We will talk about through things like slave rebellions, through protests, but also through various kinds of violent uprisings, including these and including, I guess, the ones that are occurring in Oakland, occurred in Oakland last night. And so we'll talk about that. So there's a little moniker. I don't know if you can see the "fuck the police" gallery. I wonder if they'll edit that out on the YouTube version. It really says that. So, and you can see the buildings burning. This is 1968 in Watts. And one thing about, we're teaching this class in LA. LA has been, 65, 91. LA has been a place where these kinds of uprisings have been a kind of central part of the LA landscape. Sometimes people, given where I live, sometimes people call me whenever the fires are going on, and they say, are you guys safe? And so I live in South LA, and I go, yeah, we're safe. The fire's up there in the hills, and I go, look, if there are fires that are destroying property around in a massive scale around where I live, they're man-made. And usually those have unfortunately been these kinds of issues or points. So there have also been less violent forms of oppression and responses. These are a series of signs that define that I culled from various kinds of historical things that define some of the kinds of ways in which people were socially humiliated or treated in different kinds of ways. So we have no dogs, Negroes, no Mexicans. Yeah, no, they go after the dogs. So I mean, and we can see this sign is extraordinarily designed to humiliate and in some ways deny the very humanity of someone, right? The kind of equation are perhaps placed in a hierarchy beneath dogs is a significant way. We could see the signs that were related to things like Chinese exclusion, et cetera, to think about sort of Asian Americans. Colored served in the rear. African Americans could not frequently enter restaurants. They had to go to the if the restaurant did not frequently, which they didn't have a colored section, they could go to the back and they could be served from the kitchen out the back, and they could stand back outside of the restaurant and eat there rather than be able to enter the restaurant and sit and participate in the public space. Here's restrooms, white only. White men to get out, riprap, rock breakers, 45 cents per hour. This is a sign soliciting labor, but only soliciting the labor of white men. So we can see that there is extraordinarily, not only the kinds of forms of oppression like slavery, et cetera, and lynching that were based in violence, but kind of everyday denials of basic humanity that existed around. The sign in the top corner is one out of Texas, actually, and was really about was a real attempt to kind of frequently people ask were sort of Mexicans. Though, and this sign was actually, the interesting part about it is that the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, it's a whole different history, officially granted former citizens of Mexico whiteness as status because the Mexican government understood what that meant in the context of the U.S., right? If it meant nothing, they wouldn't have tried to get it for their people living in the context of the treaty. But they got it, but in fact, in practice, right, these kinds of signs meant in practice that formal status of whiteness contrasted fairly differently with the kind of daily practice and different kinds of humiliation. There were programs where, in particular, in places where Mexicans crossed the border, they were forced to everyday women, et cetera, were forced to strip naked. And be, scrubbed with chemicals to sort of demonstrate that they were clean, that they weren't bringing diseases and other things into the U.S. when they were crossing over to work. These were the kinds of sets of practices that were engaged in that not only involved the kinds of humiliations that we're well familiar with that were heaped on African Americans sitting in the back of the bus, et cetera, that were visited upon other groups. There's a history of Chinese exclusion, where Chinese were barred from entering, both barred from Indian country, but they couldn't become citizens, et cetera. So we can see that there's a long history in the U.S. of this kind of, not only a kind of official sort of racial violence, but different kinds of social humiliation that are heaped upon people who are, quote unquote, racial others. So there are kind of options in black politics, right? So one option is voice, or resistance, so protests, violence, or either using the sort of legal system to try and transform or challenge these sets of circumstances and humiliations. One could think about accommodation, right? So let me try and blend myself in with the sort of overall American ethos, and hopefully I will gain or win some acceptance through good behavior, through comporting myself with what I perceive to be the norms of the society. And the other option is exit. Let's pack up. Let's go back to Africa. It's not working here. Or various other kinds of forms of exit, from establishing communities of runaway slaves to alternatives like the kind of those proposed by the Black Panther Party, that blacks ought to control the politics of their own community, to even some suggestions like people like the Republic of New Africa, who argued that southern states in the Black Belt ought to be handed over to African Americans to form a black homeland. These are kinds of exit options that have been explored. And interestingly enough, exit options have not always only been explored by African Americans. Abraham Lincoln, the establishment of the country Liberia in Africa was established as an experiment in whether African Americans could be repatriated back to Africa. At one point, President Lincoln, when thinking about freeing the enslaved Africans, considered using Panama or Grenada and other places as potential points where they would patriate the freed slaves to, in order to keep them from contaminating American democracy. Jefferson toyed with with various kinds of ideas. So exit has not only been something that's been contemplated. We can obviously talk about Marcus Garvey, which we will ad nauseum in his Back to Africa movement, but it's not only been a concept toyed with by black political actors, but has been one that's been profoundly considered and thought about by white actors for other reasons. There's also profound differences within the black community. I've talked about that the black community is not monolithic. The experiences of both these forms of oppression, but there are also forms of oppression that exist within black communities. There's issues within black communities. We can think about questions of gender. Black women have had profoundly different experiences, going all the way back to experiences of slavery, where sexual exploitation of black women in the context of slavery was one of the primary concerns, and one of the ways in which black women experience slavery comes across in a series of slave narratives, as well as in the stories of even people like Thomas Jefferson's former slave Sally Hemings and her children, which all evidence seems to point were fathered by him. That sexual exploitation was a part of it. It's interesting that now the current way in which they try and portray that relationship is as a kind of romance, right? In our sort of modern, this is the sort of modern take on the Jeffersons. Now that everyone sort of said, okay, so the Jefferson people originally, without the sort of DNA evidence, kept denying, okay, these people really aren't part of the whole thing. And then now that they've actually sort of broken down that barrier, so now the way to sort of save it is that this was a forbidden romance, right? Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings, who was about like 13 or 14 at the time, when he was like 60 or 70, that this was some sort of forbidden romance, that and she was completely kind of a willing participant in it. With when you're not free to go, you can't sort of make choices. This person determines whether you're going to eat or not. We can't really talk about a kind of romance in that kind of situation, right? People aren't coming to that with sort of equal points. There also, as we might recognize, currently are and always have been profound divisions of class within African American communities, income, education, that are meaningful. We can think about the ways in which, if we look at sort of some of the things that Bill Cosby has been saying recently, talking about the black underclass or black poor people, that kind of dialogue always goes back, as well as a kind of discourse amongst black middle class actors, suggesting that it's their responsibility to lift up the masses of African American people who are predominantly among some of the poorest in the U.S. polity. That's always existed. There have always been African Americans of means, education, wealth, etc., even during the period of slavery. There were small groups of African Americans who owned slaves. Most of that, though, has turned out to be people who'd acquired means and actually owned slaves on the books, but many of the people that they owned were actually their family members that they purchased. That was a way to garner their freedom, was to purchase their freedom. So there have been profound differences in class. There's also obviously, as Prop 8, not necessarily the vote on Prop 8, but just the conversation around it. We could talk about that. We'll talk about that at a later point. There are differences of sexual orientation within African American communities. Despite claims by some, there are African American gay and lesbians. The choir directors at churches prove it. And frequently, you know, the people try and cast a kind of invisibility or suggest that sort of, you know, being gay or lesbian or transgender is a, white preoccupation. It is not. The African American community has just as many gays, lesbians, transgendered folks as anyone else does. And in fact, some of the more active ones. If we think about one of the transgendered persons that helped start the Stonewall riots, which is one of the touchstones of the gay and lesbian rights movement, a lot of those folks, a lot of the transgendered folks who helped start the Stonewall riots were African American and Puerto Rican transgendered folks in New York City. And so we can think about, if we think about the sort of that being the Stonewall riot as being one of the touchstones of the gay and lesbian movement that kind of started it all, we can see the African American society. And there are debates about that, and it becomes a sort of interesting way. What is the American creed? And rather than simply accepting it, it's a sort of outsider's position, and we'll explore more of that later. So if we talk about the different ideological trends, this is a kind of set that we'll go through that are, so there's a cluster of them that are based on largely the liberal tradition that I would call radical egalitarianism, versions of the liberal tradition, conservatism, and disillusioned liberalism. There is Black Marxism, based on the larger trend of Marxist political thinking, which is, of course, itself a global trend launched by Karl Marx, who he himself was obviously not Black. You have Black nationalism, and there are different strains of that. You have revolutionary nationalism, third world internationalism, or orthodox or community-based nationalism that exist. There's different articulations of Black national of Black Marxist thinking. You have Black nationalism. We'll talk about different strains of Black nationalist thinking, cultural versus community forms of nationalism. And you also have Black feminism. That is a variant on feminist thinking, which both articulates a sort of feminist perspective, but also criticizes the ways in which dominant feminist thought does not accurately capture the problems of racism faced by Black women, but also women of color more broadly. And so we could think about those sets of trends, problems, ideas, and these are going to be the ones that we move through as we talk about the class. We're gonna think about all of them and lay them out and describe them in some detail, but also understand how they organize themselves and how they resonate. So just to do a thing, that thing says responses to failures and liberalism. I stretched this and it kind of looks funky as a result. So this is the branches of Black liberalism. So you have liberalism, you have conservatism, and you have radical egalitarianism, which is a critique of the American liberal tradition, You also have disillusioned form of liberalism, which is we're going to learn is an unstable form that leads to nationalism. But sometimes the radical egalitarian tradition, and the radical egalitarian tradition is one that reads American liberalism, in particular the references to equality, that all men are created equal, to mean equality in outcome, not just equality in sort of form or opportunity or kind of formal equality. And thinks about that, and thinks about that things have to be done to bring that on. Frequently, political actors who begin here become disillusioned with liberal thinking and begin to do things like question the basic tenets of capitalism. And that sometimes ends up turning into nationalism, Marxism, or feminism. Some radical egalitarians also take a kind of black feminist perspective. We'll talk about this in the sets of relationships. It's kind of hard to do without sitting here and explaining all the boxes. But this will make a lot more sense to you. Conservatism sometimes sits off on its own. I didn't design this, but I'll make a bold statement and say some versions of black conservatism share some really interesting ideas with various aspects of black nationalism, both historically and in the current period. And we'll talk about what that looks like, particularly on questions of gender, sexuality, quote unquote, constructing notions of respectability. Concepts of the nation always have frequently a kind of gender thing, right? Women are there to help reproduce the nation. The nation has to be led by men. So nationalists frequently, and conservatives frequently, have that kind of traditional view of things like the family, et cetera. And so trends with other philosophical origins, black Marxism is related to both Leninism as well as Maoist thinking. The Black Panther Party begun by selling versions of Chairman Mao's Little Red Book. You could also include Third World Internationalism, which includes the thinking of Che Guevara, Castroism, and ideas that come out of both China and Africa, and raising the kind of national question with the centrality of race, right? That these are movements for national liberation, particularly in sort of colonial context, but also articulated. Colonialism also had its own version of sort of racial liberation as well. You have, and one of the ways you can see, like, some of these trends end up conflicting with one another. So for instance, I was listening to, I think there's a show that comes on KPFK called Spotlight Africa. I was over here on like Saturday or Sunday or something like that, and I was listening, and a black nationalist calls in. He calls in the Spotlight Africa, and he says, you keep talking about all these problems in Africa and all these divisions amongst people, but the most important thing is all of us black folks need to achieve, unity. And he was talking to an African. And, all these other political things about whether people are progressive or not, whether they're Marxist or not, what they think about X and Y, none of that matters, right? But the most important thing is black people need to get together, right? And the woman who was hosting the show, who's an African, was trying to deal with him, because for anyone who lives in Africa, that's it's a kind of absurd thought, right? The idea that, there's some idea of African unity, but within African countries, you have, different political parties, you have different perspectives on sort of right, left, right? The idea that all black people could just obviously fit into and come to some unified discussion isn't gonna work, though there is a kind of centrality of race within that question. But say, for instance, with these kinds of things divide. So within black nationalism, there's two sort of versions. It's a kind of cultural nationalism, which believes that black people have a kind of unified culture, a kind of essentialist, an essential bond with one another that transcends political divisions, gender divisions, economic divisions, sometimes even divisions of geography, et cetera. And then there's a revolutionary nationalism that talks about, that articulates with Marxism, and thinks about sort of national liberation, but is willing to sort of think about the African American community as differentiated by class, national origin, including increasingly for many revolutionary nationalists, questions of gender and sexuality were also quite interesting. For instance, like the Black Panther Party, Huey Newton, who I would place as a revolutionary nationalist organization, actually wrote things in support of gay and lesbian rights, et cetera, though frequently they didn't necessarily always, particularly on the gender questions, didn't always practice what they preached. Black feminists make a kind of central argument, comes out of feminism, but they make the argument that you can't pull apart people's different identities, that they intersect, and they call that intersectionality. There's an amalgamation of race, class, gender, and sexual orientation, and all of those things matter. And so they say that the feminist movement or versions of African American movements, by either not including gender or not taking a holistic approach, ignored their experiences as women. And then the feminist movement ignores their experiences as black women and the centrality of racism in their lives, even racism amongst women and sexism within the black community, right? So they have a simultaneous struggle, right? They face sexism, sexual assault, other kinds of things on the part of black men and other men as well, but black men in particular, as well as the fact that they frequently are not treated equally by their quote-unquote white sisters in feminist movements, who frequently define the feminist movement in very sort of middle class and other terms. One need only watch one episode of Sex and the City to kind of see a kind of a sort of version of white feminism, right? Which is, we live on the Upper East Side. We don't have the kind of basic economic problems that other women have. Welfare isn't an issue. We're all white. The racism isn't a real central problem in our lives. And the kind of things is that, one central question for some feminists would be welfare rights is, particularly for women and their children, is very much a kind of feminist issue, but not one defined by what we understand to be a kind of mainstream middle class white feminism. Those kinds of issues, the ways in which the workplace is racially differentiated even for women, right? That race determines who has what sort of opportunities is a significant issue, even in particular for women of color, that one might ignore. The fact that I talked about welfare rights, class, and then also women aren't of all the same sexual orientations, right? So the issues faced by gay and lesbian women, who only occasionally make an appearance in things like Sex and the City, or lesbian women, transgender women as well, are quite different or significantly different than issues of straight women. And so if straight women define the feminist agenda as relating to them, so for instance, one issue that black feminists have consistently raised is that there was never an issue for black women about whether to or not enter the workplace. From the time of slavery, black women have almost always and overwhelmingly been in the workplace. It's never been an issue about them whether to or not enter the workplace. The issue has been on what terms and how they would be incorporated in the workplace. Many black women in the South and other places worked as domestic servants for white women, or we see this currently, right? So the issues of the ways in which things like Latina nannies in places like LA allow wealthy white women to go to work and advance their professional careers. These are both women. They're both working women, but they're situated very differently, and frequently the interests of the nanny and her sets of concerns are extraordinarily different, in some ways, in fact, in conflict with the other, their bosses, et cetera. Both in class terms, but also in race terms. One of the ways we can think about, and one question that consistently gets raised in terms of as we go through this course is going to be political philosophy as biography or structural analysis. And I'm going to try and emphasize the importance of historical events. But many of the thinkers that we're going to think about change over time, both because of things that happen to them personally, but as well as they're reacting to historical events. And they attempt to react to openings and closings within the American political system, as well as transformations in the global political economy. So we're going to see that Black political thought is a dynamic thing that isn't just about personal biography, but is about in some ways, some of the personal journeys of thinkers as they're responding to world events, political events within the U.S., et cetera. So what's happening now? Well, the Million Man March was a little while ago, but so it's not even now. It's like a kind of historical event. So things like the Million Man March and ascendancy, debates in the Black community over sexuality and gender, in particular around AIDS. We're also seeing a debate around the questions of Prop 8. There's a profound visibility of Black conservatives in the media, a kind of over-visibility given their sort of relationship with the masses. There's coalition politics or conflict developing with Latinos. Problems of poverty and mass incarceration grow. 1 in 4 Black men have some connection right now with the criminal justice system. America imprisons more people than any other advanced industrial democracy. An overwhelming number of those people are African Americans. And the system of incarceration touches Black families, not only poor Black families, but because of different sort of things, it touches Black families at all economic, social, and other kinds of levels. At the same time, you have a growing Black middle class. And a growing set of, as exemplified, not only a middle class, but also a growing class of African Americans educated at elite universities and institutions like UCLA, Harvard, who have advanced degrees, who are doing things like running for president and winning. And so we can see really profound transformations. Also, one thing, not on beyond the sort of coalition with politics with Latinos, one of the things that's going on now is African American communities are being differentiated by Black immigration. There are now more African Americans have now migrated to more Blacks have now migrated to the United States since the reform of immigration in the 60s than arrived through the Middle Passage. So more Africans have now come than arrived from the Middle Passage. Africans, Caribbeans, Spanish speaking. So the African American community is now increasingly being differentiated by questions of national origin, by immigrant status, by linguistic differences. Right? You have French speaking, Spanish speaking Blacks, Blacks who speak African languages, et cetera. And that's occurring even in places like LA which is sort of much smaller, that has a substantial African migrant community, but also has Caribbean communities in the context of places in Los Angeles. I once was able to participate at the inaugural dinner of the Los Angeles Cricket Club, where a substantial number of the people were Black Caribbeans from Trinidad and Tobago, from Jamaica, from places like Guyana, which is officially in South America, but South America doesn't claim them. They call them Caribbeans. So many of those, the African American community is now being increasingly differentiated. And one of the questions is there a Black public sphere, right? So is there a kind of, do we have the same coherence that we once had, say, for instance, in the 50s under segregation? And I would say that there still is some. I mean, there are alternative sets of beliefs that exist for African Americans, like some more legitimate than others, like the fact, and we saw this with sort of folks like Jeremiah Wright, like the connection between crack and the CIA. We can talk about that later. Was the CIA responsible for the crack epidemic in the early in the 80s in Black communities? What role, if any, discussions about what role, if any, we saw this with Jeremiah Wright, right? Did the U.S. government have in facilitating the spread of AIDS, both in Africa and in African American communities? African Americans, from the very beginning, from the onset of the invasion in Iraq, were overwhelmingly against that invasion, almost sort of 85 to 89%. And in fact, in many cases, and in some ways, there were articles that came out in the New York Times. A Black conservative wrote an article in the run-up to the war in Iraq about how African American opposition, almost unanimous or close to unanimous opposition to the war in Iraq, demonstrated how out of touch they were with real Americans, and that their opposition was at their own peril, and they sort of needed to get with it. And in some ways, right, in the idea is that, and underneath that was a sort of basic and a kind of discourse that this sort of unanimous response or a set of core beliefs that was sort of alternative to many other discourse communities in the U.S. meant that African Americans were, because of the sort of history of racism, the underlying idea was that African Americans were stupid in opposing the war in Iraq, right? That they just didn't know, they didn't understand, they're uninformed, and this just goes to show that they're sort of out of touch. And I've frequently done these interviews, and reporters ask me these questions that kind of implicitly have this line, and I say, well, if you think about it, African Americans, in terms of their views about the need for a universal healthcare system, a kind of skepticism about foreign adventures, and a bunch of other things, are very much in step with our European neighbors. So I frequently end with, African Americans would make good Swedes. And I think that always throws people off, right? Which is, so if African American opinion represents the opinion of the overwhelming bent in African American opinion, represents the opinion of most people in the world about a range of different issues, and certainly most people in advanced industrial democracies, then who's off base? Right? We might pose the question differently, right? Who is outside of the norm? And so you can see that there are kind of points of, despite the diversity in the African American community, there are kind of core alternative beliefs and discourses that exist. Though things like sort of hip hop music and others are making discourses, as well as obviously YouTube, are making discourses that were within Black communities more public. Yeah.
In regards to the war in Iraq, I was wondering if you knew the numbers of African Americans in the military and how that plays in, because I know that a lot of African American men have joined the military, and how that plays in with the opposition to the war in Iraq.
Yeah, well, Blacks are slightly overrepresented particularly in the U.S. Army, vis-a-vis their population, in particular black women are. And the military has frequently, for African Americans, been a route, particularly for the poor, has been a route to economic mobility, a way to get educational benefits. And many of the people that signed up never intended to go fight in a war anywhere. So that's actually kind of a lot of the opposition was that, we signed up to go into the military, but I signed up to get some money to go to college. I didn't really intend to get shot at over in the desert somewhere. That's not to say that they're not patriotic and not happy to serve their country, but different people have different perspectives. And African Americans overwhelmingly took a very skeptical view about the war in Iraq and what they were being told. Yes?
I was just gonna add to that. I looked at some statistics for another class, and like overwhelmingly, blacks will tend to go in like the air wing or not ground combat type thing. So not as much in artillery or in infantry, and that kind of ties into what you're saying, where they're looking for other things that might lead to other opportunities. Versus like it's hard to find a job after you've been like doing artillery for
Right, or infantry. Right. And it's interesting too because Latinos overwhelmingly join the Marines. And there's a certain kind of discourse about why that is, et cetera. So actually Latinos are overwhelmingly found frequently now increasingly found in combat situations, whereas African Americans do in terms of what their service selections are. But they still have, one of the problems is they have difficult times, because the services have different sort of testing criteria and stuff like that. African Americans have difficult times getting into places like the Navy is really sort of underrepresented, the Air Force, et cetera. So they have a lot harder time getting into those spaces. So some of that is kind of, but yeah, there was very strong opposition to the war in Iraq amongst African Americans, as well as like the sort of overwhelming response to the President-elect Obama and the sort of early rally around his candidacy and the discussions about him. There's a whole, one, you'd only go on the web and find there's a whole set of websites and others and discussions. And, I remember right in the run up to the election, there was like a probably 18 or 19-year-old kid at the gas station wearing like an Obama shirt who was like telling me, you need to get out and vote. He was working hard to turn me out to vote. And I was like, wow, something has, happened. Not that, both that he was, that excited, so previously like he might've had, a Biggie Small t-shirt or his Rockaware or whatever, but it was Barack Obama. And then beyond that, right, like he's gonna stop and, really encourage, he's probably voting for the first time, but he's gonna make sure that I know to vote and, find out where your polling place is and the whole thing. And I was like, and I didn't tell him, I'm kind of a political scientist and I, kind of got this thing covered, but I was like, thank you. Like, I really appreciate it, no, but it just goes to show that there was a organic groundswell that happened in different kinds of spaces where people, and I remember early on, even in the primary center, I went down to Chaos in Leimert Park. I was actually showing some visitors from Colombia around, and there were these little girls, and they were developing like a play they were developing like a play on their own. They were like 9 or 10 about what Barack Obama and what it was going to mean to them. And these are like 9 or 10-year-old girls in these kinds of spaces. And it just happened, it was almost overnight. And it was funny because last September, most of the interviews I took from the press were all about like why black people don't like Barack Obama and why black women won't vote for him and they're gonna vote for Hillary Clinton. And I was like, hold on, just give it a minute. You'll see what happens. And lo and behold, it did. But the point is that there is a kind of sphere and there are kind of spaces of African-American discourse. We'll stop there for today. Thank you. I'll see you guys on Tuesday.